Okay, so we want to focus on corporate governance in relation to a broader context, in relation to a societal context, and to see what it works like in that sense. So, corporate governance is an interesting term. It tends to get understood in a more generic context as being good governance, right? So, what is good governance for a firm, and what do we need to do to reach good outcomes for firms broader than financial outcomes? Well, actually, it's not. At least in the academic domain, it tends to get conflated with an extremely narrow idea of what companies are and what they are for, right? So if you look at it technically, corporate governance can be defined as the way that the modern capitalist corporation is governed. How are they administrated and structured, by whom and for whom? This is very technocratic, right? This is a very underlying structural view of what, how you deal with corporations. So in that framing, corporate governance structures the relations between different types of stakeholders within the corporation, but that's not generally acknowledged that it has that structuring effect. That becomes sort of implicit to the way corporate governance works. So why do we think that corporate governance could be a broader thing, actually? And why is it that we engage with this theory as something which could be a broader theory of what corporations are and how corporations are, for what purpose corporations exist? The basic thing is that the corporate form, as opposed to the partnership form, has become the most dominant way to structure businesses since the mid-20th century. We tend to think of it as a very, as a thing that's always been around in the same form and shape, but it hasn't. It has actually a very long history of theoretical development. And it's only since the mid-20th century that the modern corporate form as we know it now has developed. The central feature of the corporate form is that, as Roland Means put it, the atom of property is split. That means that you do not have direct owners, you do not have direct managers, you have a complicated relationship between the two, in which ownership does not lie directly with shareholders, and management has been transferred in a more open sense to managers than you would find in a partnership. Now, there's a long conceptual history behind that I won't bore you with, but the takeaway point from that is that you can actually say in company law that shareholders are not owners, right? This is opposite to most of the stuff that you will hear nowadays. Shareholders are not owners. So the conceptual framing of what a corporation is and what corporate governance is actually frames a lot of what you can do in relation to corporations and how you can do strategy within corporations. It also frames how the relations between constituencies within and outside the corporation are structured. Right? So the academic lens on this could be helpful. It's only after the 70s that we get this dominance of the theory that we take for granted nowadays, which is agency theory. Agency theory stating that there is a direct relation between shareholders and managers are there to actually serve the shareholders and to maximize shareholder value in the interest of the shareholders. In that simplistic dyadic notion of what corporate governance is, dyadic in terms of having two constituencies only and only taking that central setup as the basis for corporate governance, the relation, the object and control of corporate governance are restricted to boards and shareholders. And thereby, shareholders will give immense incentives to managers to do exactly what they wanted to do, which is to maximize shareholder value. By the same token, market metrics become central to the strategy of corporations, and that strategy becomes geared towards maximizing shareholder value again. So yeah, you get a kind of a redefinition of what corporation is, you get a redefinition of what control is and what a contract is within the concept of a corporation. By that token, you get a threat of a market for corporate control. The market for corporate control is a concept that's not very often expanded upon outside the sort of central area of corporate governance research. But it means that basically shareholders exercise direct control over managers through the market value of a corporation. Now, if that is central to how you remunerate managers, it means that those managers become directly tied into the same interests as the interests of the shareholders, right? So that puts on, that means that you start to prioritize value creation for shareholders. It creates immense pressures to produce value in the short term rather than the long term, because you need to prove your worth towards the shareholders, and it leads to the adoption of generic management strategies. At the same time, it also means that you start to think of corporations as a very different beast, right? They're no longer a going concern. They're no longer a set of relations internally. They become just a set of value streams that you can cut up, that you can remarket, that you can monetize at any moment in time if you want to. And actually, you're going to be evaluated on the basis of how well you are doing the cutting up, how well you are performing on producing immediate value out of all the possibilities that you can get out of the corporation. And again, by the same token, you start to de-emphasize long-term value creation, you get a decline of longevity of corporations, you get a decline of innovation strategies, and also, obviously, you start to exclude stakeholder interests structurally. Because if this is on the agenda, you cannot do anything beyond that, right? So this is the reason why we say that CSR is not going to do anything, right? If you have this on the agenda, and this is the way that you think of what managers should do, if this is what you think that a corporation is, then you can talk morals whatever you like, but it's not going to change anything because you're tied into this particular conception of how a corporation works and what managers should do. This is actually sort of the same argument. You get a restricted conception of purpose, a restricted conception of relevant constituencies. So the only constituencies that really matter in this dyadic conception are shareholders and managers, and you have structurally no recognition of externalities, right? So sustainability, human rights, etc., become embellishments, philanthropy. They are not central to corporate strategy anymore. And at the same time, as we said before, you get a negation of the going concern, short-term contracts, defined contribution, pension plans, decline of welfare state provisions. That all feeds into the idea of how these corporations should function. It's a very normative way of looking at markets and corporations in there. Right. Because you have that exclusivity in the dyadic governance relation, you also get a strong presumption of private, market-oriented, market-based monitoring. Because these are extremely private constructs, we also assume that the only persons that can actually monitor them in terms of market value would be shareholders, right? So if shareholders are the only one who can actually assess the ongoing value of a corporation, obviously your monitoring is also going to take place in private domain, i.e. in the market, right? So therefore, states should step back and should not be involved in direct regulation of corporations anymore, not in the national sphere, not in the international sphere. So what we end up with is exclusive value creation for two constituencies. And what we've seen in the last 20, 30 years, and I think that there's a direct correlation between the two, and there's quite some people who believe this with me, is that there's a sharp rise in proportion of corporate value going to shareholders and managers, and it is directly tied up with what we see in terms of the increase in inequality in developed countries.
So we proposed a sort of a symbolic change to the recitals to recognize that shareholders do not in fact own public companies, which are independent legal entities, and that they do play an important role in corporate governance, but this is balanced out by other stakeholders as well. And that's been taken up. It's still in the text, and it's tried to try and lay the groundwork for future amendments or for future initiatives that would bring in other stakeholders. And we also proposed incentives for long-term shareholding, and member states would be able to choose how to actually do that, whether it's through dividends or capital gains tax reductions for long-term shareholders, which is defined as more than 2 years. That doesn't look like it'll survive after the vote, but at least it's in right now. Italy and France already have national laws that promote that, so we might see this come back on the table in the future. And there's also country-by-country reporting, which would require public companies to disclose how much tax they're reporting or they're paying in each member state across the EU. So there's lots of other changes as well, but those are sort of the most relevant for right now. And then after it goes through the plenary vote, we'll have to see what happens from council. So we should get an update on that next year. And then finally, we've been doing some work around publications plain language publications, and one of the outputs of that is the Pocket Guide, which you have here today. And this provides a short overview of what is corporate governance and company law, but I think more importantly, why should we care about it? And sort of trying to tie it into some of the policy issues that we care about at civil society, like sustainability, inequality, and sort of issues within supply chains.
Small, always beautiful. 5 people in a tech company can do a huge amount of damage to human rights. So, is that our objective, or is it we're ending the worst types of behaviour, the most egregious or the most widespread impacts? And if that is our call to action, then big isn't necessarily bad at all. And interestingly, South Africa's role in this treaty discussion in the UN today, in theory, is compelled by that second objective, while Ecuador's is the first. And can those two things coexist within the same effort? And then we've also heard achieving greater worker equality is another objective, which doesn't necessarily sit with the other two. Trade union global framework agreements, for example. Great way, very popular with the global trade union movement, work particularly well with multinational companies. So, the framing of the issue: reform, risking co-option, or disruption, risking failure. Are we interested primarily in the state-business nexus, or the business-customer-public nexus, or both? The next one is one we just don't talk about enough, and Phil knows I bang on about this. We were talking about this the other day. Is this a pre-competitive issue or a competitive issue? If you're in business, you want to know that straight away. Level playing field, or an ability to compete on the field or beyond or around the field. Mixed messages from governments, I would say also mixed messages from civil society sometimes. And what are the means we use? Governance, leadership, behaviour, the business case versus moral case we've talked about, the nexus we've talked about. This one's important: prevention versus remedy. If you want to incentivise prevention, you can't beat up on a company as much as you would have done if they hadn't tried to prevent it. Bad things will still happen to good companies. If I dragged 10 people screaming from companies to sit here now, they would say this is one of the biggest disincentives they have from civil society, is that their company, they feel that they invest in prevention, yet if they screw up, they will get beaten up as much as a company that didn't give a damn. So, is due diligence a mitigating factor? Carrot or stick? Public or discreet? And of course, human rights NGOs engage in a lot of discreet lobbying and advice with governments and business every day of the week around the world that the public are never engaged in. For businesses, we often hear about the red tape, but of course there often is a business case for regulation. Businesses are afraid of the absence of a level playing field. Lack of clarity from states. Businesses often say, and I've been on trade missions with governments, I've talked to businesses over gin and tonics and night, and they're getting very mixed messages from the Tory minister or Prince Andrew on the trade mission than they do when they go and see the Human Rights Department of the Foreign Office. Government is not speaking with one voice to businesses at the moment. Anything we can do to try and get government to talk coherently to business will help us, I think. Well, as long as they're saying the right thing. No reward for undertaking due diligence or prevention. I would say that's true. I don't think there's no political award, there's no public opinion award, there's no NGO reward. Should there be? What's competitive, what isn't? And then, I think I've probably covered most of the incentives there. And then finally, I'll just finish. Making the call for change, right. So I think the 4 questions for us: what is the change we want to see? I don't think we have a common objective, and I don't think we have a common theory of change about how the world works in this room. And I would say that you need one, we need one, or at least to have enough of a common theory of change for us to be successful. What are those next opportunities to be seized? Is it Carney's speech in November? Is it the G7, G20? Is it the ILO, International Labour convention next year? Is it something else? Is it the Greek crisis? And then how do we mobilise? And do we have the right assets and skills to be successful? I guess that's it. Thank you.